The coffee crystals in that jar were already brewed once, in a factory, maybe a year before you ever opened the lid. Then they were frozen to 60 below zero, shattered like glass, and boiled away into nothing. This is how instant coffee is made, and it hides one of the most interesting facts about your morning. That powder is real coffee that had its water stolen. Picture a coffee pot the size of a house. That is where it begins. Roasted beans are ground coarse and packed into towering steel columns. Then water is forced through them, hotter than anything you would ever brew with at home. Not quite boiling water, water pushed far past boiling, held under pressure so it cannot escape as steam. It strips the beans of everything, not just the bright flavors you taste in a normal cup, but the deep, stubborn compounds that ordinary brewing leaves trapped inside. And they never brew just one batch. The columns stand linked in a long row, a battery of them. Fresh hot water enters the most spent column first, then flows on to fresher grounds, growing stronger at every step. By the time it leaves the last column, it has robbed the beans of nearly everything. A huge share of the beans simply dissolves away. What is left is spent grounds, still steaming, dumped out to be dried and burned for fuel. What drips from the bottom is not a drink. It is coffee concentrate, thick, dark, almost too bitter to sip. And now the factory faces one strange problem. How do you remove every last drop of water from coffee without killing the taste? The first answer is violent. The concentrate is sprayed into the top of a tower taller than a house as a fine mist of tiny droplets. Blasting up to meet them is air hot enough to scald. In the time it takes the droplet to fall, the water is gone. What lands at the bottom is dry powder, a cup of coffee turned to dust in a single breath. This is spray drying. It is fast, it is cheap, and it makes most of the instant coffee on earth. And the scale is hard to picture. A single tower can swallow oceans of liquid coffee and rain it back down as powder, hour after hour, never stopping. In some countries, most of the coffee anyone drinks begins exactly here. Whole nations wake up on a cup that was brewed by a machine they will never see, in a country they may never visit. But that heat comes at a price. Coffee aroma is delicate. The moment that scalding air hits the droplet, the best smells burn off and vanish up the tower. So the powder that lands at the bottom is technically coffee, but it barely smells like it. The factories know this, so they do something that sounds almost dishonest. Before the drying, they capture the aroma. They trap those fragile, escaping smells as an oil, and store them. Then, at the very end, they spray that captured aroma back onto the finished powder. The smell that hits you when you open a fresh jar was added last, on purpose. There is one last piece of theater with the cheap powder. On its own, spray-dried coffee is a fine dust that floats and clumps in the cup, so it is blasted with steam until the specks fuse into bigger grains. That is why some instant coffee looks like little crystals, proud on the label. It was born as dust, then glued into something that looks handmade. I always find myself wondering where this is being heard right now. A kitchen in Brazil, a night shift in Japan, a cold morning somewhere in Canada. All of them holding a jar made the same strange way. So I am curious. Which country are you watching from right now? Not the city, the country. And keep that in mind, because the next method makes the first one look crude. Because there is a second way to dry coffee, and it does the opposite of burning it. Instead of heat, it uses cold, brutal cold. The concentrate is chilled until it freezes into a solid dark slab, like a sheet of coffee ice. That slab is then broken into tiny granules. Now comes the part that feels impossible. Those frozen granules are placed inside a sealed vacuum chamber. The air is pulled out until there is almost nothing left. And in that near emptiness, something bizarre happens to the ice. It does not melt. It never becomes liquid at all. The frozen water turns straight into vapor and drifts away, solid to gas, skipping the liquid stage entirely. Scientists call it sublimation. It is the same trick that makes dry ice smoke without ever leaving a puddle. Here is why the factory goes to all that trouble. Liquid water would carry the flavor away with it as it left. But vapor rising from frozen coffee leaves the taste behind. The aroma stays locked inside the granule, frozen in place. That is freeze-drying, and it keeps far more of the real coffee than heat ever could. So think about the strange paradox hiding in the instant coffee aisle. The cheap jar was made by nearly burning the coffee alive in a tower of hot air. The expensive jar was made by nearly freezing it to death, then vanishing the ice into thin air. Same bean, same first brew. Two opposite extremes, heat and cold, both used to reach the exact same goal. Dry coffee that comes back to life in water. And that idea, coffee brought back to life, is older and darker than you would think. The technology behind freeze-drying was not perfected for your morning cup. It was pushed forward in wartime to preserve medicine and blood plasma, so it could be shipped dry and revived later with water. Coffee borrowed the same science. A drink paused so it could survive the journey and wake up months later in your kitchen. The push for instant coffee came partly from a mountain of it. Brazil once sat on a coffee surplus so vast that beans were being burned as fuel, and a solution was needed to stop all of it going to waste. The answer was to turn the flood of coffee into a powder that would never spoil. Something that could sit on a shelf for years and still become a drink in seconds. And it barely ages. With the water gone, the slow chemistry that turns fresh coffee stale almost grinds to a halt. Sealed and dry, a jar can outlast the very beans it came from. Which is a good moment for a small test, purely from instinct, which sounds worse for a coffee bean, being boiled past its limit, or being frozen to 60 below. One word, boiled or frozen. Write it below. Now look closely at a single freeze-dried granule, because this is the part I still cannot get over. It is not solid the way it looks. When the ice sublimated away, it left behind the empty spaces where the water crystals used to be. So each granule is riddled with microscopic hollow tunnels. It is less like a rock and more like a tiny rigid sponge made of dried coffee. That structure is the whole secret. The instant you pour hot water in, it floods those empty tunnels. The granule collapses back into the drink it once was. You are not dissolving a powder. You are rehydrating a coffee that was frozen in time. And the taste it carries was sealed inside the moment the water left. A flavor caught, held still, sometimes for a year or more, waiting in the dark of the jar. Which changes what that boring jar in your cupboard really is. It is not a shortcut or a lesser coffee. It is a cup that was already brewed, somewhere far away, then paused midlife. The water was pulled out so time could not touch it, and your kettle simply presses play again. Every spoonful is a little time capsule, a drink from the past, frozen or scorched into stillness, reawakened the second it meets hot water. I still cannot get my head around one of these, that your coffee was made before you ever decided to drink it. Which fact shocked you the most?